Why is my father's name scratched off this bus deed, and why is there a metal lockbox hidden under the driver's seat? The lawyer asked, but no one answered. The rusted yellow school bus sat behind a towing yard in North Carolina, its paint peeling like burned paper, seats torn open, windows fogged with years of neglect. A single paper deed trembled in the mother's hand, edges soft from rain and handling, while her young son stood beside her, staring at the underside of the driver's seat where something didn't belong. Something solid, deliberate, wrong. No one mentioned the lockbox. No one was supposed to know it was there. 3 days earlier, the world had already decided what she was worth. A single mother, 34, working double shifts at a roadside diner off Highway 17, counting every dollar before it disappeared into rent, groceries, and overdue electricity notices taped to her apartment door. Her son, Daniel, had stopped asking for new things months ago, as if he already understood scarcity better than childhood. Then the letter arrived, not in an elegant envelope, but in a bent manila folder smelling faintly of oil and old paper. Inside, a deed to a school bus, listed under the name of a distant relative she barely remembered, someone her family had once called the quiet one who collected broken things. Her neighbors laughed when the tow truck delivered it. One man in a baseball cap actually clapped sarcastically as the bus rolled into view, its metal frame groaning like it was tired of existing. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard, not an inheritance," someone said, loud enough for her to hear. She said nothing. She had learned that silence was cheaper than defense. Still, she ran her hand along the bus door that evening, feeling the cold bite of rust under her fingertips, noticing how the paint still held faint traces of school district lettering beneath the corrosion. It didn't feel worthless. It felt forgotten in a way that had intention behind it. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with a flickering lamp, the deed beside a stack of unpaid bills, and made a decision she didn't fully understand yet. She would not sell it immediately. She would look inside first. The bus arrived at the edge of an abandoned lot behind an old storage warehouse, its tires barely holding air, its frame sinking slightly into the dirt as if relieved to stop moving. Daniel was the first to climb inside. His footsteps echoed through the hollow aisle, dust rising in slow spirals as if the air itself was remembering movement. "Mom," he called quietly from the front. "There's something weird under the driver's seat." She walked forward, the metal floor creaking under her weight, the smell of old gasoline stronger near the front panel. Kneeling, she saw it too. A seam in the metal that didn't match the rest of the structure, too clean, too precise. She pressed her fingers along it and felt it give slightly, like a secret holding its breath. That's when she realized the bus wasn't just abandoned. It had been closed on purpose. Her fingers pressed harder into the seam beneath the driver's seat, and the metal gave a quiet click, soft, intentional, like something waking up after years of pretending to be dead. Daniel leaned closer, his breath shallow. "Mom!" It moved. Before she could respond, a distant shout came from the edge of the lot. The tow yard manager was watching them now, arms crossed, impatience already forming on his face as if the bus itself was wasting his time. "You've got until the end of the week to clear this junk," he called out, not even bothering to hide the word. Junk. That word followed her everywhere lately, like a label she couldn't peel off her skin. 3 days earlier, she had already been standing at the edge of collapse. Her apartment lease termination notice had been taped to her door with red ink across the top. Final warning, 5 days to vacate. Inside, the only furniture she still owned outright was a cracked kitchen table, 2 folding chairs, and a mattress that sank in the middle like a tired breath. Her bank account had $211.43 left, every dollar already assigned to something more urgent than dignity. Gas, utilities, Daniel's school lunch balance, and a prescription she still hadn't filled because she had to choose between breathing easier and keeping a roof overhead one more week. That morning, she had stood in line at the pharmacy for 20 minutes before quietly turning away when she saw the total. No argument, no complant. Just a slow folding of the receipt before putting it back in her pocket like it weighed too much to carry out loud. People had started treating her differently long before the bus arrived. Her hours at the diner had been cut without explanation. Just a polite, "We're restructuring staffing," from a manager who wouldn't meet her eyes. A coworker had joked that she should find something more realistic, laughing as if survival was a hobby she was failing at. Even her sister had stopped answering calls, only texting once. "You need to figure your life out before you drag Daniel down with you." That message still sat on her phone, unread again and again, like reopening a wound on purpose. Now, standing inside the hollow shell of the bus, she felt that same pressure closing in from all sides. The metal floor was cold enough to numb her knees as she knelt, trying to understand the seam beneath the driver's seat. It wasn't damage. It was precision. Someone had welded this section shut and disguised it under years of rust and neglect. That meant intention. That meant effort. Daniel shifted beside her, pointing at a faint indentation near the latch. "There's letters here," he said quietly. She leaned in. Barely visible under grime, half erased but still deliberate, were stamped markings. A partial code, something like a parcel number or internal designation, too clean to belong to a scrapyard. Her stomach tightened without reason she could explain yet. Behind them, the tow yard manager checked his phone, already bored again, already convinced this entire inheritance was a mistake. But when his eyes drifted back toward the bus and landed on the mark Daniel had just pointed out, something in his expression changed for half a second. Too fast to be casual, too sharp to be nothing. Then he looked away, like he had seen something he wasn't supposed to recognize. And suddenly, the idea of selling this junk didn't feel like the end anymore. It felt like the beginning of something someone had tried very hard to bury. The tow yard manager's eyes lingered on the faint stamped code under the driver's seat for a second too long before he turned away, as if deciding not to see it at all. "End of the week," he repeated. But this time his voice sounded less confident, like the word junk had started to lose its meaning. That night, she didn't sleep. The bus sat outside under a weak parking light, its rusted frame casting a long shadow across the gravel like something waiting to be claimed. Daniel was the one who kept returning to the front step, staring at the seam beneath the driver's seat, as if afraid it would disappear if he stopped looking at it. By morning, she made a decision she didn't fully understand yet. Not to sell, not to walk away, to register it, to make it hers in a way no one could dismiss with a laugh. The county clerk's office was 32 miles away, down a road that smelled like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. She drove an aging sedan with a cracked windshield and exactly $211.43 left in her account after paying for gas, a number she kept checking in her head like a countdown. Daniel sat beside her holding the bus deed folder on his lap, the paper edges now soft from being opened and closed too many times. Inside the clerk's office, fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of metal counters. A man in line ahead of her was arguing about property taxes, his voice rising until the clerk calmly slid a printed sheet toward him and said, "Sir, the county has already marked it as non-recoverable value." That phrase followed her when she stepped forward. Non-recoverable value. She placed the bus deed on the counter. The clerk didn't look impressed. She looked tired, the way people look when they've seen too many stories like this end badly. "School bus inheritance transfer," the woman said, typing slowly. Her nails tapped once against the keyboard when the system lagged. Then she paused. Just a fraction. Her eyes shifted to a code printed on the deed. "Where did you say this vehicle is located now?" she asked. "Private lot off Route 17, the mother replied. The clerk didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled a second sheet from beneath the counter, a county asset registry map, and placed it flat. Between them, a small circle was drawn in faded ink near the bus identification number, but it looked like it had been marked over, then partially erased, then marked again by a different hand. Behind them, a man in a suit who had been waiting silently in the corner stood up the moment he saw the paper. He didn't approach the counter. He just left. Fast. No explanation, no glance back. Daniel noticed it too. "Mom, why did he leave like that?" She didn't have an answer. The clerk cleared her throat and continued the process, sliding a form across the counter with unusual precision, as if avoiding eye contact with the paper itself. You'll need to sign here confirming acceptance of all assets, including enclosed structures or compartments, she said, emphasizing the last words slightly too carefully. Enclosed compartments. The pen felt heavier than it should have when she took it. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows of the building, rattling them faintly like something trying to get in. When she signed her name, the ink spread slightly on the cheap paper, bleeding into the line beneath it as if it didn't want to stay still. The clerk stamped the document once, then slid the final copy forward without speaking. On her way out, Daniel held the deed tightly against his chest, his fingers pressing into the folder as if he could feel something inside it breathing. And as they stepped into the parking lot, she noticed something that made her stop for half a second. The clerk had not filed the final page in the system. It was still sitting face down on her desk, as if even the county wasn't ready to acknowledge what they had just officially placed in her hands. The clerk's final stamp still echoed in her mind as they drove back, a dull mechanical sound like something being sealed shut. Daniel sat in the passenger seat holding the deed tighter than before, as if it might change shape if he loosened his grip. Neither of them spoke for miles. The road back to the bus felt longer, heavier, like it was pulling them toward something neither of them fully understood yet. When they finally arrived, the afternoon light had shifted into a pale, washed-out gold that made the rusted school bus look even older, like it had been waiting there longer than time itself cared to remember. The tow yard gate was half open. No one came out to greet them this time, only silence. And the bus. Up close, the rust wasn't just surface level anymore. It had patterns, layers, like scars that had been covered and uncovered too many times. The front door creaked when she pushed it open, the sound sharp enough to make Daniel flinch. Inside, the air was different from outside. Heavier. Stale. It smelled like old oil trapped inside metal, mixed with something faintly sweet she couldn't place yet. She stepped in first, one hand on the frame, feeling the floor shift slightly under her weight. Not broken. Not empty. Just waiting. She set a small cardboard box down in the aisle. Everything she owned reduced to clothes, a bottle of water, and 2 cans of soup. Daniel followed, running his fingers along the seat backs, each one torn open like someone had been searching for something in a hurry years ago. A faded calendar still hung near the driver's area, its pages stuck together, frozen on a year so old the ink had begun to blur into itself. She noticed a cracked mug sitting under the front dash, still stained with a ring of dried coffee. Someone had once been here long enough to drink from it more than once. That thought made her pause longer than she expected. "We'll stay here tonight," she said quietly. Not as a question, but as a fact she didn't have the luxury to debate. Daniel nodded, already moving to clear a small space behind the driver's seat. She pulled a thin blanket from her bag and folded it twice, placing it carefully on the worn metal floor. The cold still came through, but at least it was flat ground. She checked the small outlet panel near the front step out of habit, knowing it wouldn't work, and it didn't. No power, no water, no promise of anything except time. Still, she opened one of the soup cans with a pocket tool and ate slowly, listening to the sound of the bus settling as the temperature dropped outside. That's when she noticed it. A section of the interior wall near the driver's seat didn't match the rest. The paint was slightly newer, just a shade too clean, as if someone had tried to hide a repair but didn't quite match the age of everything around it. She knelt, pressing her hand against it. It didn't feel hollow exactly, but it didn't feel solid either. A difference you only notice when everything else around it is too quiet. Daniel leaned in beside her. "That part wasn't like that before," he said softly. Before she could respond, a faint sound came from behind the panel. Not loud, not obvious, just a soft, irregular tick, like something small shifting inside metal that didn't want to be heard. And in that moment, the bus didn't feel empty anymore. The faint ticking behind the panel didn't stop after they noticed it. It only became easier to hear, like the bus itself had decided silence was no longer an option. Daniel stayed close to her that night, both of them lying on thin blankets spread across the metal floor while the wind pressed against the bus like slow breathing from the outside world. At some point, she stopped trying to interpret the sound and simply stored it away like everything else she couldn't afford to solve yet. Morning came cold, gray, and damp, the kind of North Carolina humidity that clings to rust and makes everything feel older than it is. She sat up with a sharp ache in her lower back and looked at her hands, already red from cold water, small cuts forming along the knuckles from yesterday's work. There was no time to question where they were anymore. Survival had already decided for them. She tied her hair back, pulled on the same worn hoodie from yesterday, and stepped out into the gravel lot where the bus stood like a stranded animal. The first thing she did was clean. Not because it was hopeful, but because it was necessary. She found an old broom behind the warehouse, bristles half melted, and began sweeping broken glass from the aisle. Each push scraped across metal with a sound like something being erased. Daniel helped carry trash bags, dragging torn seat foam and rust flakes out into a growing pile beside the bus. The work was slow, repetitive, almost meditative in a way that hurt more than it healed. At one point, she climbed onto a small step stool and taped a clear plastic sheet over a cracked window, pressing duct tape along the edges until her fingers went numb. She had learned this kind of survival years ago, patching leaks in hospital shifts when supplies ran low, improvising stability out of almost nothing. It wasn't new to her. It was just heavier now. By midday, she had cleared enough space to see the bus differently. What had looked like wreckage yesterday now revealed structure underneath. Bolts still intact, seat frames still aligned, metal ribs still holding shape. Someone had built this thing to last longer than its condition suggested. That thought stayed with her as she wiped dust from what used to be the driver's console. A small drawer beneath it resisted when she pulled. Locked, but not properly. It shifted slightly, as if something inside had been jamming it from the wrong side. Daniel crouched beside her, watching as she used a flat screwdriver to gently pry it open. The drawer popped with a dry snap. Inside was not much, just a folded receipt, yellowed at the edges, and a small metal object she didn't recognize at first. The receipt had a name printed at the top, but not the name of her relative. Someone else entirely. A supply company, a service order, something that didn't belong in a school bus. She frowned, trying to place it in a normal explanation, maintenance, storage, old administrative paperwork. But the date on it didn't match the bus's known timeline. It was too recent, too intentional. She turned it over again, slower this time, as if the paper might change if she looked long enough. That's when Daniel pointed under the console. A small gap between panels had been sealed, then reopened. The edge was uneven, like it had been forced shut after being accessed once before. And as she leaned closer, something metallic shifted deeper inside the structure. Just once, soft and deliberate, like something responding to being disturbed for the first time in a very long time. The receipt still lay open on the metal console when the sound of footsteps came through the gravel outside the bus. Slow, uneven, like someone who had walked this road more times than they could remember. She froze for a moment, instinctively covering the drawer without thinking, as if hiding it from the air itself. Daniel looked up first. A man stood at the base of the bus steps, late 60s maybe, wearing a faded work jacket with oil stains that had long since become part of the fabric. In one hand he held a paper grocery bag, in the other a small toolbox that looked older than both of them combined. "Didn't think anyone would actually move back into this thing," he said, not unkindly, just surprised, like he was looking at a memory that had decided to come back wrong. She didn't answer immediately. People didn't usually arrive with kindness attached unless there was a reason. "I'm Roy," he added after a beat, nodding toward the bus like it deserved respect even in its condition. "Used to work maintenance for the county fleet. Saw this unit on the registry years back. Thought it was retired properly." His eyes drifted toward the open console. He noticed the drawer was loose but didn't comment on it. Instead, he lifted the grocery bag slightly. "Brought coffee and bread. Figured you might not have had a real breakfast yet." The smell of it hit her before she could refuse. Cheap diner coffee, strong enough to cut through exhaustion. She accepted it carefully, the warmth burning her fingers in a way that felt unfamiliar. Daniel, who had been quiet since the morning, took the bag of bread without hesitation. Roy stepped inside slowly, his boots making a hollow sound against the bus floor. He didn't explore like an intruder. He moved like someone returning to a place they weren't sure they had the right to miss. His eyes paused on the panel under the driver's seat, then drifted away just slightly too fast. Funny thing about these old units, he said almost to himself. People think they know what they were built for, but most don't. She studied him now more closely. You said maintenance? She asked. He nodded, setting the toolbox down near the first row of seats. County fleet, yeah. Back when things were still organized. He stopped himself there. Like the next word belonged to a version of the past he wasn't allowed to fully open. Daniel handed him the receipt they had found earlier without prompting. Roy's fingers tightened slightly when he saw it. Not fear exactly. Recognition held back too quickly. Where did you get this? He asked. Inside the console drawer, she replied. He exhaled through his nose, slow. That company. They weren't supposed to touch this unit after '09. He didn't explain further. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A worn metal key attached to a cracked plastic tag. The tag had a faded number on it, almost identical to the partial code they had seen earlier under the driver's seat. He didn't offer it. He just held it loosely, like he wasn't sure it still belonged to him. Your father ever talk about working here? He asked suddenly. The question landed heavier than expected. She shook her head. He wasn't my father, she said quietly. Distant relative. I barely knew him. Roy nodded, but not in agreement. More like confirmation of something he already suspected. He looked past her, toward the sealed panel under the seat again, then lowered his voice slightly. He wasn't distant to the people around here. Not back then. A pause. Outside, the wind pressed against the metal shell of the bus, making it hum faintly like something alive but restrained. Roy reached into his toolbox and placed a small wrench on the step beside her. If that compartment opens the way I think it does, he said, you're going to want to be ready before it does. His eyes met hers for the first time fully. Steady, unreadable, but not empty. And in that moment, as he stepped back toward the door without finishing his thought, she noticed the key in his hand matched the lock beneath the driver's seat almost exactly, down to a notch she hadn't seen before. The bus was quiet for a long minute, except for the faint hum of the wind rattling through a cracked window near the back. She crouched near the driver's side console, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam along the metal floor, across the seam where Daniel had first spotted the uneven panel. The floorboard along that seam was newer than the surrounding metal, subtly different in texture and color, almost imperceptible until the light hit. Just right. She tapped it with the end of the flashlight, listening to the hollow echo beneath. It responded differently from the rest of the floor, a muted thud that hinted at a cavity. She knelt lower, pressing her palm against the surface, running her fingers along a thin scratch that traced diagonally toward the wall, as if marking a path someone had intended to follow. The sound of rain pattered faintly against the roof, each drop accentuating the quiet inside the hollow bus. She knelt by the console again, comparing the receipt they had found to a faded ledger page Daniel had retrieved from the drawer, noticing the same partial number stamped faintly on both. The pattern gnawed at her, and she ran the flashlight along the wall where the scratch led. The paint didn't match, newer, slightly glossier, as if someone had tried to disguise a repair or cover a seam. She tried to reason it away. Maybe it had been a quick fix after a minor leak or an old maintenance job. But her instincts, honed from years of working in hospitals and making do with broken equipment, whispered that this was intentional. Daniel, crouched nearby, tapped a loose screw with his finger and it rolled under the seat with a tiny clink that echoed like a warning. She got up and knelt by the small locker in the back, attempting to twist the handle. It resisted slightly, like the screws had been tightened from the inside, deliberately. Outside, a car door slammed 2 blocks away, sharp, startling her, and she froze mid-motion. Her phone buzzed for a second. No name, no number, just a silent alert, and she silenced it quickly, more out of habit than fear. Returning her attention inside, she noticed a thin gap along the edge of the panel beneath the driver's seat. Too uniform to be accidental, almost like a finger could slide between it if pressed just so. She bent lower, tracing the line carefully, and then pressed the edge of her flashlight into the seam. The light reflected off metal beneath the surface, faint, polished in a way it shouldn't have been if the panel were truly solid. A cold realization prickled along her spine. Someone had intentionally hidden something here, and it had been waiting for her to notice. The floor scratches, the mismatched paint, the hidden locker screws, even the partial numbers on the ledger and receipt. They were not random. They were breadcrumbs. She swallowed hard and pressed closer, following the diagonal scratch from floor to wall, and finally, at the corner where the wall met the baseboard, her fingers found a subtle ridge. A seam, a gap, a code hidden in plain sight, as if the bus itself was nudging her toward it. Her fingers lingered on the subtle ridge beneath the driver's seat, tracing it slowly until she found the small indentation where the metal panel gave just enough to pry. Using a flathead screwdriver, she wedged it gently and felt a soft click as the panel shifted, revealing a narrow cavity lined with dust and the faint scent of old oil. Inside, wrapped in a thin, brittle cloth that had yellowed with age, sat a small lockbox, its brass latch tarnished and dulled by decades of neglect. She inhaled sharply, the smell of aged metal and a hint of coffee from some long-forgotten lunch wafting out as she brushed the grime away. Kneeling on the cold floor, she ran her fingers along the box's edges, noting tiny scratches and a faint set of initials engraved near the hinge, partially worn but still readable. Daniel crouched beside her, whispering, "Mom, is that it?" She nodded without speaking, her pulse racing. Slowly, she flipped the latch with the key Roy had handed her, feeling the resistance of a lock long and used. The lid creaked open, revealing a stack of yellowed papers, a small Polaroid photo with corners curling, and a folded envelope tied with brittle string. She lifted the top sheet, careful not to tear it, and read the handwriting. Slightly shaky, deliberate, the ink faded but legible. A familiar surname leapt out at her eyes, the same as the distant relative who had left her the bus. The date was decades old, yet the location mentioned matched the bus's current lot, down to the county route number. She exhaled slowly, sitting back on the floor, tucking Daniel close as she carefully unfolded the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of ledger paper with coffee stains at the corner, numbers scribbled in. Careful columns, a signature partially altered, and an address that matched the bus deed exactly. Her hand went numb for a moment, gripping the paper so tightly it crumpled slightly. Questions spun in her mind. Who else knew about this? Why was it hidden under the seat? What did the ledger and the initials mean? She tucked the envelope into her jacket pocket, photographing the Polaroid and papers quickly on her phone with its remaining 3% battery, then set the box back in the cavity as if she hadn't touched it at all. Roy leaned over, his eyes scanning the edges of the panel, but he said only, "Looks like your relative didn't want just anyone finding this." She nodded, heart hammering, and held the photo closer. The face staring back was partially cut in the image, but the handwriting on the ledger confirmed one truth that froze her. This wasn't random inheritance. It had been intended for her. And at the bottom of the ledger, a single line in careful, deliberate script spelled out her middle name, linking the lockbox, the bus, and the legacy directly to her. The moment her finger brushed across the ledger again, she felt it differently this time. Less like paper, more like weight, as if the past itself had been pressed into thin, fragile sheets. Daniel sat beside her on the cold bus floor, watching as she carefully unfolded the next pages, her breath slowing without her permission. The handwriting continued in uneven lines, dated across different years, each entry marked not like a diary, but like a record of something being carefully protected. Roy had stayed near the bus steps, silent now, his earlier certainty replaced with something heavier, like recognition he didn't want to fully name. "He kept records," Roy said quietly after a long pause, pointing to a line near the bottom of the page. "Your relative, he didn't trust memory. Only paper." Her eyes followed his finger. The ledger listed names, families, workers, a few handwritten notes beside each entry. Small payments, repairs, medical costs, nothing large. Nothing that would explain why this bus mattered. But what stopped her was not the numbers. It was the pattern. Every few entries, the same initials, appeared again and again, marked beside small notes like assisted, covered, or temporary hold on eviction notice. She traced one line with her fingertip, noticing the ink smudged slightly, as if someone had written it in a hurry under poor light. Roy exhaled slowly, like he had been carrying the weight of this memory for years. He used to come by the hardware store every week, he said. Never bought anything for himself. Always said it was for someone else who couldn't afford it. He paused, eyes dropping toward the ledger again. People thought he was just fixing old buildings, but he was keeping people in them. She looked up at him sharply. Keeping them? Roy nodded. Rent, repairs, sometimes food, sometimes medical bills. Quietly, no record in the official system. Just here. He tapped the ledger gently. Daniel leaned closer, pointing at a folded receipt tucked between pages. The paper was thinner than the rest, stamped with a hospital logo from years ago. Her stomach tightened as she unfolded it. Payment made in cash. Her name was not on it, but the surname was close enough to make her breath catch. Roy noticed her reaction but didn't interrupt. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something she hadn't seen before. A small cassette tape, its label handwritten in faded ink. He asked me to keep this, he said quietly. Said if anything ever came back to the bus, someone would need to hear it. The word bus hung heavier than before. She turned the cassette over in her hands, noticing the worn edges, the way it had been handled too many times to be accidental. Why didn't he just say all this? She asked, almost to herself. Roy hesitated. For the first time, his voice lost its steadiness. Because some people don't get to say things out loud without consequences. That word, consequences, settled into the bus like a draft through broken glass. She flipped another page in the ledger, slower now, and saw something she hadn't expected. A final entry. Not a name, not a payment, just a note written in darker ink than the rest. If she ever finds this, don't let them take it from her like they took it from me. Her hand stopped moving. Daniel looked at her, sensing the shift without understanding it. Roy stepped closer, reading over her shoulder, and for the first time he didn't hide his reaction. His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, at a name written just beneath the margin. One she had seen before on the deed, but now connected to something far larger, something buried on purpose. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the bus, making the metal frame groan like it was remembering things it was never meant to say. And as she closed the ledger slowly, carefully, she realized the truth wasn't just about what had been left behind. It was about who had tried very hard to make sure she would eventually find it. The ledger was still open on her lap when the sound of Roy's earlier warning seemed to echo back inside her head. Don't let them take it from her like they took it from me. Daniel sat frozen beside her, watching as she slowly turned page after page, each line now feeling heavier than paper had any right to be. Roy didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stepped down from the bus and looked out across the empty lot as if checking whether the world outside had shifted while they weren't looking. That last entry, he finally said, voice lower now. That wasn't just a note. That was a warning. She looked up sharply. A warning about what? Roy hesitated, then reached into his jacket again, pulling out a folded county map, old, worn, edges softened from years of handling. He spread it across the bus step, smoothing it with his palm. There, faint but visible, was the bus parcel number again. But this time it wasn't alone. It was connected by thin pencil lines to another marked property just half a mile away. Your relative didn't just own the bus, Roy said. He was tied to the land around it, and not in a simple way. Her pulse quickened as she traced the line on the map with her finger. The second parcel wasn't listed under her deed. It wasn't in her paperwork at all. But the ledger entry she had just read referenced it multiple times, along with numbers that looked less like expenses and more like allocations. Daniel leaned closer. Mom, this other place, it's ours too? She didn't answer. immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone and zoomed in on the photograph of the ledger page she had taken earlier. One of the entries matched a partial bank reference number. She searched it quickly, hands trembling slightly as the signal struggled in and out. What came up wasn't a bank account in the normal sense. It was a dormant trust classification, flagged decades ago, tied to community land preservation assets. Her breath caught. Roy noticed the change in her face. "You found it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "The part they never cleaned out." Before she could respond, the sound of tires crunching gravel came from outside the lot. A black SUV had pulled up near the edge of the warehouse fence, engine idling too long to be casual. Daniel shifted closer to her instinctively. Roy didn't move, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he recognized it. "That's not a local car," he said under his breath. She quickly closed the ledger, slipping it into her jacket, heart now hammering harder than the wind outside. The SUV door opened slowly, and a man in a pressed coat stepped out, holding a folder already open in his hand, as if he had been expecting to arrive with information ready. He didn't look at the bus at first. He looked at her. "We were hoping to resolve this quietly," he called out politely, voice calm in a way that felt rehearsed. "That property you've come into, it's been misclassified for years. It's unsafe for habitation and legally complicated." He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "We can offer you compensation, far above market consideration." Roy muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "They already know what it's worth." And as the man took one step closer, placing the folder under his arm like a final offer, a single document slipped loose just enough for her to see the header: County Trust Recovery and Land Reassignment, and beneath it, a figure crossed out and rewritten 3 times, each version larger than the last, as if someone had been slowly revealing the truth they no longer wanted hidden. The man in the pressed coat lingered at the edge of the bus lot, hands tucked behind his back like he had all the patience in the world. "We're only trying to help," he said smoothly, flipping through the folder with a casual precision that belied the threat in every page. She glanced down and realized the top sheet was a purchase agreement, pre-filled, offering a sum just above what she could imagine selling the bus for, but with clauses she didn't have the means to challenge. An unpaid lien, code violations, and a county procedure note warning that the property could be seized if unresolved. "It's valuable," he added quietly, almost conversationally, "but unsafe, and honestly, you may not be capable of managing it." His eyes met hers, polite, measured, leaving no doubt that the word capable was loaded. Daniel shifted behind her, clutching the envelope containing the ledger and the Polaroid she had photographed earlier, but she kept her hand over it instinctively, refusing to hand over the originals. Outside, the SUV engine idled softly, a reminder that this visit wasn't casual. She took a breath, forcing herself to focus, scanning each document, noting a line that didn't match the deed she had held just hours before. A signature slightly misaligned, ink a shade darker than the rest, time-stamped years earlier than the ledger entries she had seen. The implication was immediate. Someone had attempted to manufacture authority over this property, and they were counting on her inexperience to accept it. She photographed the suspicious pages with her phone, her fingers trembling as the battery percentage dipped to 2%, then slipped the originals back into the envelope, tucking it inside her jacket. The man in the coat flipped one more page, revealing a county notice about improperly filed easements. And for a moment he hesitated, his polite smile flickering as if uncertain how much she could see. "For the family," he murmured, gesturing vaguely toward the lot. His tone measured but insinuating ownership beyond the bus itself. Roy stepped slightly forward, eyes narrow, noting a minor discrepancy in the ledger she held. A missing page that seemed to have been deliberately removed years ago. "Watch that," he muttered, but said nothing more. The man in the coat folded the folder, gave a final, almost imperceptible nod, and walked back toward the SUV. She stayed rooted, clutching the envelope and the Polaroid, the bus looming behind her in the late afternoon light, knowing now that the property was no longer just a rusted vehicle. It was something they wanted to claim, and she had evidence they hadn't yet seen. And in that tense silence, the faint metallic scratch beneath the driver's seat whispered that the bus still held secrets, ones that could protect her if she was brave enough to follow them. The county records office smelled like old paper and disinfectant, the kind of sterile cold that made every sound feel louder than it should. She stood at the counter again, this time not alone. Roy was beside her, and Daniel held the envelope so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. Across from them, the same man in the pressed coat sat with 2 county officials and a lawyer she didn't recognize, folders stacked neatly like they already owned the outcome. "This is a simple correction," the man in the coat said, sliding a revised purchase packet forward. "There was a clerical error in the trust assignment. The property was never meant to be fully transferred." His voice stayed calm, practiced, almost gentle. "We're here to resolve it before it becomes complicated." The word complicated landed like a warning dressed as politeness. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she placed the ledger on the counter. Just that. "No explanation." The room didn't react at first. Paper is only paper until someone understands what it contains. Roy stepped forward slightly and added the copy of the county map they had found earlier. The faint red line connecting the bus parcel to the adjacent land was visible even from where the officials sat. A clerk reached for it, hesitant, and the moment her eyes tracked the parcel numbers, her expression changed, subtle at first, then still. "That number isn't in the current registry," she said quietly. The man in the coat smiled faintly. "Because it was consolidated years ago under a redevelopment clause." She slid the ledger page forward next. "The one with the missing entry. The one with the altered signature." The lawyer on the opposite side leaned in, flipping through it quickly, then slower, then stopped entirely when he reached a page where the handwriting clearly didn't match the rest of the document set. The room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a collective recalibration of attention. Daniel, still holding the envelope, pulled out the Polaroid and placed it beside the ledger. The faded image showed the bus decades earlier, clean, operational, with the same partial identification number painted clearly on its side, matching the one currently under dispute. The county official closest to her frowned. "This photo predates the alleged transfer," he said. The man in the coat exhaled softly, still composed. "Old maintenance vehicles circulate through multiple departments. Photos are not proof of ownership." Roy didn't argue. He simply reached into his jacket and placed a small cassette recorder on the counter. "Then play it," he said. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was resistance giving way. One of the officials pressed play. The room filled with static first, then a voice, older, strained, unmistakably connected to the ledger entries. If they ever try to file it under redevelopment, it was never theirs to begin with. The man in the coat's expression didn't change immediately, but something in his posture tightened. Just slightly. The clerk at the far end of the table turned a page in the file system, then stopped. "There's a recorded discrepancy," she said almost reluctantly. The lawyer on the opposing side tried to regain control. "Even if this is authentic, it doesn't establish current legal standing," he began, but stopped mid-sentence when Roy slid a final document forward. A notarized witness statement from a retired county maintenance supervisor, confirming the bus and adjacent land were intentionally excluded from prior redevelopment due to protected use classification. That was when the pen in the county official's hand stopped moving. He didn't speak right away. He just read the ledger again, slower this time, as if realizing it had been waiting longer than any of them. The man in the coat finally looked at her directly. No longer smiling. Not angry. Not loud. Just exposed. And for the first time since this began, no one in the room offered her a suggestion, a correction, or a dismissal. They waited, and she realized the question was no longer whether she had proof, but what she was willing to do with what the truth had finally given back to her. The silence in the county office didn't break quickly. It settled first, heavy, uncomfortable, like everyone in the room had just realized the story they thought they understood was no longer the story at all. Then the county official finally lowered the pen. "Based on recorded evidence, the prior classification of this property is invalid under current documentation," he said carefully. each word chosen like it might be reviewed later in court. The man in the pressed coat didn't interrupt. For the first time, he wasn't guiding the conversation. He was inside it, trapped by it. Daniel held his breath as the clerk typed rapidly, pulling up archived records. Roy stood slightly behind her, arms folded, not celebrating, just watching history correct itself in real time. The trust designation is active, the clerk confirmed after a long pause. And it was never legally transferred out of protected status. That sentence changed the temperature of the room. The lawyer across from them blinked once, then flipped back through his own copy of the file, slower now, as if hoping a different version would appear. Didn't. The ledger sat open on the counter like a witness that had finally been allowed to speak. She didn't smile. Not yet. Her hand simply rested on it, steady, as if grounding herself in something that had survived long before anyone tried to rewrite it. The man in the coat cleared his throat softly. Even if that is the case, he said, voice tightening just slightly, this does not change the safety violations. The structure is still non-compliant for residential use. The county will still require. Roy cut in for the first time, calm but firm. It was never registered as residential. That's the point you keep missing. The words landed without force, but they didn't need force anymore. They had documents. They had records. They had truth that no longer fit inside anyone else's version of events. A second clerk entered quietly, placing a corrected deed packet on the counter. She slid it forward with hesitation, as if even touching it felt like stepping into something too long ignored. This supersedes all prior claims, she said. The stamp came down once. Sharp, final, not loud but absolute. The man in the coat exhaled through his nose, and for the first time since he arrived at the bus, his composure didn't recover. No argument followed. Only silence and the soft sound of paper being gathered back into folders that no longer had power. Outside, later that evening, the lot felt different. Not because the rusted bus had changed, but because the air around it had. Roy handed her the corrected deed without ceremony. Daniel ran his fingers along the metal step of the bus, no longer treating it like junk, but like something anchored. She looked at the words printed cleanly now across the top of the document. Her name properly placed where it had always belonged, as if the system had finally learned how to read it. The ledger was closed now, resting in her hands instead of buried under dust and secrecy. The key Roy had once held wasn't needed anymore. It had become something else entirely. Proof that doors are only locked until someone is finally meant to open them. The bus door creaked as she stepped inside one last time that night, not as someone lost inside a forgotten inheritance, but as someone standing inside what had been waiting for her all along. Outside, the wind moved gently across the empty lot, and for the first time, the rusted school bus didn't look like something abandoned. It looked like something finally found.